Welcome back to Island Bike Life. On today's video, we're going to be doing a how-to on servicing the Switch Infinity links on these new Yeti bikes. Also being covered will be the service, cleaning, and maintenance of all the rear pivot points. This is going to be relevant not only to the SB150, but to this new brand of bikes from Yeti, including the SB140, 130, and to a lesser extent the SB100. This is going to be different a little bit between each model, so if you have one, the general principles will maintain, but make sure you're checking the user manual provided from Yeti to make sure that your torque specs and all of those sorts of things are correct.
This job is not that difficult and overall shouldn't take you more than about half an hour once you're used to the steps. Servicing the Switch Infinity links on new Yetis is a bit more time consuming as it requires you to now remove the main pivot bolt to access the grease ports. This wasn't the case on the previous generations. Because I'm doing a drivetrain cleaning as well, I removed my cranks, chain, derailleur, and cable housing. This isn't a required step if you are just gonna grease your Switch Infinity link, but removing your rear wheel every time will make this job a little bit easier. The tools required are pretty basic, with no real specialty items being required. Some of them are nice to haves, while some of them are going to be mandatory in order to get this job done. The first step is to remove the main pivot bolt. It has a smaller collet wedge bolt that will need to be removed first. Once that is out, you remove the main bolt with the nut that is set into the frame on the opposite side. Secure the rear triangle out of the way so you have access to work. I normally use a releasable zip tie to secure to my seat post or the saddle itself. Be mindful of your brake or shifter housing if you left them in the frame to avoid damaging them. The Switch Infinity link is held in by 4 bolts that need to be removed. Once they are out of the way, the link comes out in one solid piece. Careful not to lose the little spacers, and the orientation of these later is going to be important. Inside the Switch Infinity link, the stanchions just slide out of the unit once it's unbolted. At this point, it's time to clean all of the bolts, the Switch Infinity housing, and the stanchions themselves. I like to use a soft microfiber towel on the stanchions just to be safe, though lint-free rags won't hurt them any. Inspect the stanchions for any wearing or damage. Mine were still looking good after about 18 months of use, so that's good news. Take the time to force the bearing in the unit to move around and ensure the grease ports are clear of any debris. One other thing I like to do is really deep clean the little nooks and crannies to ensure no debris gets inside when I reseal it all. With the stanchions back inside, use the specific grease that is required for this as recommended by Yeti with a grease gun until it pushes out from both the top and the bottom. Clean up the excess grease that has oozed out and repeat this for the other side. If you are just simply adding grease, which I do every 2 to 3 months just to be safe, you don't have to remove the link from the entire frame. You just need to move the rear triangle up and out of the way in order for you to gain access. To reinstall, put all 4 bolts back into the frame with the spacers in the correct orientation. The rounded edge should be facing either down towards the ground or up towards the sky. Add a drop of blue Loctite to each of the threads on these bolts and slide the Switch Infinity link back inside the frame. Hand tighten each of these 4 bolts in a crisscross pattern, turning each one a few turns each time as you go so as to avoid any cross threading. Once they are hand tight, again in a crisscross pattern, torque each of them down to 12 newtons. Align your rear triangle and put the main pivot bolt back into the frame after greasing the shaft of it as well as the threads, and torque this down into the frame to 12 newtons. Grease the wedge of the collet bolt and the threads and torque this down to 14 newtons. This is the end of the basic Switch Infinity service, which does take very little time at all and can be done in probably under 10 minutes. If you're going to clean and service the upper links and pivots, continue on to the next steps. I wanted to see if this service could be done without removing the rear shock entirely in order to save just a little bit more time. In the end, you can do the removal of the linkage with the shock installed, but I found you cannot reinstall it with it there. So, if you're doing this yourself, remove the rear shock after the shock extender bolt is removed. The first bolts to be removed are the upper rear triangle bolts. There is one on either side. There is a keyed nut for each of them that are inserted behind these into the linkage itself. Next, remove the collet bolt and axle from the shock extenders. This is a tight fit and, depending on your water bottle cage or how it's designed, you might need to remove it. Once the bolt is removed, continue to remove the front bolt on the rear shock and get it out of the way for when you reinstall everything later. At this point, your rear shock should be removed from your frame. The last part of the linkage removal requires 2 Allen keys to remove the lower bolt. With those gone, the whole linkage will simply slide out. In the upper rear triangle, there are 2 bearing lock rings. It is a good idea to remove these with a cassette tool and re-grease the threads. With this linkage removed, you will need 2 Allen keys to remove the shock extender arms. Once free, they will fall out, but do be careful. There are small end caps that can go missing. There should be 2 of them in total. Fully clean all of the bolts, the linkage, and extender arms, and inspect for any damage or any excessive wear. Inspect the bearings in the linkage and in the arms and force them to rotate to keep them from seizing up. At this point, if something looks off, Yeti does now offer full rebuild kits for the linkage as well as the Switch Infinity if you need to replace anything. Once everything is clean, it's time to reassemble the linkage outside of the frame before we reinstall. A small bit of grease will help the extender arm caps stay in place while you get them aligned into the linkage. A guide pin here will make your life way easier and help you get the bolt back through. It can be done without it, but it is a little bit more challenging. Secure these bolts hand tight and then torque everything down to 10 newtons. This is all that's required for the assembly outside of the frame, and so now get ready to put it back in there and bolt everything back together. Reinstall the bearing lock rings just hand tight with a cassette tool after you've greased those threads. Start with the lower linkage bolts first. You will need 2 Allen keys again for this part, and once you've secured everything into the frame hand tight, torque this down to 15 newtons. Make sure you use the torque wrench on the male side of the bolt and not the female to avoid any damage and to ensure that you're getting a proper torque reading. Next, align the upper linkage into the rear triangle and push the female bolts into the side after lightly greasing them. It was at this step that I realized the shock has to come out in order for the reinstall to happen. You can't get the shock extender arms back around in an appropriate manner with the shock not removed. Aligning the rear eyelet with the shock extender arms, insert the collet axle from the bottom, pushing it towards the top, and torque this down to 13 newtons. Grease the wedge and threads of the collet axle bolt and torque this one down to 8 newtons, which is basically hand tight, but to be safe, I used a torque wrench anyway. With that done, you are left to secure the front of the shock to the down tube. Using a guide pin here helps, but it isn't really necessary. You're going to need 2 Allen keys again to get this to tighten up properly. you're going to want to tighten this hand tight and then down to around 12 newtons. Overall, this service isn't too bad, and though the linkage looks a bit complicated, it really isn't any more work than the previous Yeti bikes or any other bike for that matter. If you take your time, you can get through this easily, and is a good service to do at least every year, if not at the end of each sort of riding season change. I hope you found the Switch Infinity and linkage video useful. There's some other maintenance videos on the channel, so check those out as well. If you have any requests for other maintenance videos you'd like to see, leave me a comment down below. Before you go, give me a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button. Thanks again for watching. Now let's go hit the trail.